The morning sun cast long shadows across Buckingham Palace as Catherine Middleton stood before an ornate mirror, her reflection revealing a woman who had never imagined she would one day wear the crown that now seemed inevitable. Just months ago, she was planning charity galas and school visits. Today, the weight of a 1,000-year monarchy rested on her shoulders. William paced behind her, his usually composed demeanor cracked with the pressure of ascending to the throne decades earlier than anyone had anticipated. The phone call that changed everything still echoed in their minds. Urgent voices, solemn words, and the sudden realization that their quiet family life was about to become the most scrutinized existence on Earth. But here's what no royal biography would ever tell you. Behind the gilded doors and ceremonial preparations, Catherine and William were just two people trying to figure out how to raise their children, protect their marriage, and serve a nation that was watching their every move. The world expected perfection from their new king and queen, but perfection was the last thing on their minds as they prepared for a debut that would either unite a kingdom or expose the fragility of an ancient institution. What happened next would surprise even the most seasoned royal watchers and change the British monarchy forever. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn golden when the phone rang at Adelaide Cottage. Catherine was helping Charlotte with her homework, while George practiced piano in the background, the familiar melody of a Mozart sonata filling their cozy home. William was in his study reviewing documents for an upcoming environmental summit, completely unaware that this ordinary Tuesday evening would be their last as the Prince and Princess of Wales. Catherine noticed William's phone buzzing insistently on the kitchen counter. She glanced at the caller ID and felt her stomach drop. It was Sir Clive Alderton, King Charles's private secretary. Official calls at this hour never brought good news. "William?" She called softly, not wanting to alarm the children. "You need to take this." William appeared in the doorway, taking one look at Catherine's pale face before answering. The conversation was brief, conducted in hushed, urgent tones that made Catherine's heart race. She watched her husband's face transform from confusion to shock, then to something she had rarely seen in all their years together. Genuine fear. "We need to go," William said after hanging up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now." The drive to Windsor Castle passed in a blur of streetlights and silence. Catherine held William's hand tightly as their protection officers navigated through the evening traffic with practiced efficiency. The children had been left with Maria, their nanny, who asked no questions when Catherine explained they had urgent family business to attend to. King Charles had suffered a massive heart attack during a private dinner with Camilla. The doctors at Windsor Castle's medical facility were working frantically, but the prognosis was unclear. More shocking still, the king had been dealing with health issues he had kept private from everyone except his closest medical team and Camilla. When they arrived at the castle, the scene was controlled chaos. Senior courtiers moved through the corridors with clipboards and phones, their faces grave. The Prime Minister's car was pulling up as William and Catherine hurried toward the king's private apartments. Camilla met them at the door, her usual composed demeanor shattered. Her eyes were red with tears she was fighting to contain. "He's stable for now," she managed to say, "but William, you need to know there are things he never told you. Things about his health." The next few hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed nightmare. Constitutional lawyers appeared with briefing papers about succession protocols. The Archbishop of Canterbury was contacted. The Prime Minister held quiet conversations with the Cabinet Secretary about continuity of government. But for Catherine, the most surreal moment came when Sir Clive pulled her aside and gently explained what her new role would entail. Queen Consort. The words felt foreign in her mouth. She had always known this day might come, but in the distant future when she was older, more prepared when her children were grown. "Your Majesty," Sir Clive said, using her new title for the first time. Catherine actually looked behind her to see who he was addressing. William spent the night at his father's bedside, holding vigil in the way that sons do when they realize their parents are mortal after all. King Charles drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to recognize his son, sometimes lost in medication-induced confusion. During one of his clearer moments, Charles grasped William's hand with surprising strength. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. You're not ready. None of us are ready." William squeezed his father's hand back. "We'll figure it out, Pa. Catherine and we'll figure it out together." The king's condition stabilized over the next few days, but the damage to his heart was extensive. The royal physicians were clear. King Charles would need to step back from his duties immediately. The stress of the crown, they explained, could be fatal in his current condition. This left the country in an unprecedented situation. While Charles remained technically king, he was unable to perform royal duties. The solution was a regency, with William serving as Prince Regent with full royal powers. But everyone knew it was really an abdication in all but name. The announcement to the public was carefully crafted to maintain dignity while preparing the nation for what was essentially a changing of the guard. King Charles would retain his title but withdraw from public life to focus on his health. The Prince of Wales would assume full royal duties as Prince Regent, with the Princess of Wales taking on the role traditionally held by the Queen Consort. Catherine found herself in the surreal position of preparing for queenly duties without actually being queen. The distinction felt meaningless when she was suddenly responsible for state dinners, official receptions, and representing the crown at major events. The first test came just a week after King Charles's heart attack. The Japanese emperor was arriving for a state visit that had been planned for months. Canceling would send the wrong message about the monarchy's stability, but proceeding meant Catherine would be hosting her first major state occasion, under circumstances she had never imagined. The days leading up to the emperor's arrival were a crash course in royal protocol that would have been overwhelming under the best circumstances. Catherine worked with Lady Susan Hussey, one of the late Queen Elizabeth's most trusted ladies-in-waiting, to master the intricate choreography of a state banquet. "Remember, Your Royal Highness," Lady Susan advised during one of their practice sessions, "the emperor will expect to be seated to your right. The conversation topics have been prepared by the Foreign Office, but you must make it feel natural, and, whatever you do, don't mention the war." Catherine nodded, making mental notes while simultaneously worrying about how George and Charlotte were adjusting to their dramatically changed circumstances. The children had been told that Grandpa was sick and that Daddy and Mummy would be very busy for a while, but explaining why photographers were now following them to school required conversations she had hoped to delay for years. The night before the state banquet, Catherine stood in the same ornate mirror where our story began, watching palace staff make final adjustments to a tiara that felt impossibly heavy. The Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara had belonged to Princess Diana, and wearing it felt like carrying the weight of history and expectation. William appeared behind her in his full-dress uniform, looking every inch the future king he was about to become. "You look beautiful," he said softly, but Catherine could hear the worry in his voice. "I look terrified," she replied honestly. "Good," William said, surprising her. "That means you understand what we're taking on." They stood together in comfortable silence, both lost in thoughts about how quickly their lives had changed. Just days ago, their biggest concern was Charlotte's upcoming school play. Now they were preparing to represent the crown at one of the most important diplomatic events of the year. The morning of the state banquet dawned gray and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to match the somber mood at the palace. Catherine woke early, unable to sleep, and found herself walking through the staterooms, where she would soon be entertaining foreign dignitaries. The ballroom was being transformed by an army of staff who moved with the precision of a ballet company. Crystal chandeliers were polished to perfection, gold chairs arranged with mathematical precision, and the table settings laid out according to protocols that dated back centuries. Catherine watched the preparations with a mixture of awe and anxiety. This was her world now, whether she felt ready or not. The girl who had once worked as an accessories buyer was about to host one of the most powerful leaders in the world. As the morning progressed, briefing papers arrived from the Foreign Office with detailed information about the emperor's interests, preferences, and the diplomatic objectives for the visit. Catherine studied them like exam notes, determined not to let her country down. But the real preparation was emotional. Standing in rooms where Queen Elizabeth had once entertained world leaders, Catherine felt the weight of continuity and tradition. She was now part of a story that stretched back over 1,000 years, a story that would continue long after she was gone. The Emperor's arrival at Horse Guards Parade was Catherine's first major public appearance in her new role. Standing beside William as he inspected the Guard of Honor, she could feel thousands of eyes upon her, analyzing her every gesture and expression. The crowd that had gathered to witness the ceremony was larger than usual, drawn by curiosity about the royal couple who had been thrust into the spotlight under such dramatic circumstances. Catherine could hear whispers and see phones pointed in her direction, capturing every moment for social media analysis. As the ceremonial carriage procession made its way to Buckingham Palace, Catherine practiced the smile she had perfected over years of royal engagements. But inside, she was calculating everything from the timing of conversations to the positioning of photographs that would define how the world saw the new royal partnership. The state banquet that evening was Catherine's debut as the effective Queen of England. 170 guests filled the ballroom, including cabinet ministers, diplomats, business leaders, and cultural figures. Each had been carefully chosen to represent the best of British society. Catherine entered the ballroom on William's arm, wearing a midnight blue velvet gown by her favorite designer and the diamond tiara that caught the light from a dozen crystal chandeliers. The sight was breathtaking, but what impressed the guests most was her composure under pressure. During dinner, Catherine navigated conversations in 3 languages, discussed trade relationships with Japanese business leaders, and charmed cultural ambassadors with her knowledge of contemporary art. She had spent weeks preparing for these conversations, but her natural warmth and genuine interest in people shone through the formal protocol. The emperor himself seemed genuinely delighted by his hosts. During his speech, he praised the grace and wisdom of the royal couple who were clearly prepared to lead Britain into a new era of international cooperation. It was exactly the kind of endorsement the monarchy needed during this transition period. But the real test came during the evening's unexpected crisis. Just as dessert was being served, Sir Clive appeared at William's shoulder with urgent news. There had been a terrorist incident in Manchester, and the Prime Minister needed to speak with the Prince Regent immediately. William excused himself as quietly as possible, but his absence was noticed by the alert diplomatic corps. Catherine found herself in the impossible position of continuing to host the state banquet while knowing that something serious was happening elsewhere. Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Catherine kept the conversation flowing, ensured the emperor felt properly attended to, and managed to signal the palace staff to extend the musical entertainment to buy William time to handle the crisis. When William returned an hour later, his face was grave but controlled. With the slightest nod to Catherine, he indicated that the situation was under control but that they would need to address it publicly soon. The evening concluded with the traditional exchange of gifts and promises of continued friendship between their nations. As the last guest departed, Catherine finally allowed herself to acknowledge what had just happened. She had successfully hosted her first state banquet under extraordinary pressure, and nobody in that room would have guessed it was her debut performance. Later that night, as they finally returned to Adelaide Cottage, Catherine kicked off her formal shoes and sank into their familiar sofa. George and Charlotte were asleep, blissfully unaware of the diplomatic triumph their mother had just achieved. "How do you think we did?" Catherine asked William as he loosened his white tie. William sat beside her, pulling her close in a gesture that was purely personal, not royal. "I think," he said carefully, "that we might actually be able to do this." It was the first moment since that Tuesday phone call that either of them had allowed themselves to feel hopeful. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But they had survived their first major test, and that felt like a small miracle. As Catherine drifted off to sleep that night, she thought about the journey that had brought her from a middle-class family in Berkshire to the threshold of the British throne. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new protocols to master, new ways to serve a country that was watching their every move. But tonight, she was simply Catherine, wife and mother, who had done something extraordinary and lived to tell the tale. The girl who had once been dismissed as Waity Katie had proven she was ready for whatever came next. The phone calls, the emergency meetings, the crash course in constitutional law, it had all led to this moment of quiet confidence. They weren't ready when that phone rang, but they were learning that sometimes readiness comes not from preparation, but from the willingness to step forward when history calls. In just a few days, everything would change again. But for now, Catherine Middleton was learning that being queen wasn't about feeling ready. It was about being present when your country needed you most. 3 weeks after the successful state banquet, Catherine stood in the yellow drawing room of Buckingham Palace, facing a crisis that no amount of protocol training could have prepared her for. The morning newspapers were spread across the antique mahogany table, their headlines screaming variations of the same devastating story: Royal Family in Crisis and Prince Harry's bombshell revelations. Harry had chosen this moment, when the monarchy was already vulnerable, to publish a tell-all interview with an American magazine. In it, he detailed private family conversations, criticized William's leadership style, and questioned whether Catherine was prepared for her new responsibilities. The timing couldn't have been worse. William paced the length of the ornate room, his jaw clenched in barely controlled anger. How could he do this now? He muttered, running his hands through his hair. Doesn't he understand what we're trying to hold together here? Catherine studied the newspapers with the analytical mind that had made her so effective in her previous life. The headlines were sensational, but as she read the actual quotes, she realized something important. Harry's words, while hurtful, revealed more about his own pain than any genuine criticism of their leadership. "He's hurting," she said quietly, causing William to stop pacing. "This isn't really about us, William. It's about Dad, about the family falling apart when he needed us most." The private secretary knocked and entered with even more troubling news. The Prime Minister was requesting an urgent meeting. Parliament was asking questions about the stability of the monarchy during this transition period. Some MPs were even suggesting that perhaps it was time to discuss the future of the institution itself. Catherine felt the familiar flutter of panic in her chest, but she had learned to breathe through it over the past few weeks. The breathing techniques her old yoga instructor had taught her years ago were proving surprisingly useful in royal crises. "Schedule the meeting," William instructed Sir Clive. "But first, I want to speak to Harry." The phone call to California was arranged through diplomatic channels, with the time difference meaning it was early morning there. Catherine sat beside William as he waited for his brother to answer, both of them knowing this conversation could determine the future of their family and their monarchy. Harry's voice came through the speaker, defensive and tired. "I suppose you're calling about the interview." "Harry, what were you thinking?" William's voice was controlled, but Catherine could hear the hurt underneath. "We're trying to hold everything together here, and you're giving interviews about our private conversations?" There was a long pause before Harry responded. "I'm tired of pretending everything is fine, William. I'm tired of watching this family destroy itself for the sake of an institution that doesn't care about any of us as actual people." Catherine leaned forward toward the phone. "Harry, it's Catherine. Can we talk about this properly, all of us together?" Another pause, longer this time. When Harry spoke again, his voice was softer. "How are the children handling all this, Catherine? Really?" It was such a Harry question, cutting through the royal protocol to what actually mattered. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes as she thought about George's anxiety attacks and Charlotte's confused questions about why Grandpa Charles couldn't visit anymore. "They're struggling," she admitted honestly. "George keeps asking when things will go back to normal, and Charlotte doesn't understand why she can't just call Grandpa when she wants to talk to him." So the conversation that followed was the most honest the three of them had shared in years. Harry talked about his guilt over leaving the family during a crisis. William spoke about the impossible pressure of taking on the crown decades before he expected to. Catherine found herself mediating between the brothers, a role she had played countless times before, but never with stakes this high. By the end of the hour-long call, they had reached a tentative agreement. Harry would issue a statement clarifying his comments and expressing support for William's regency. In return, William would arrange for Harry to visit King Charles privately, away from media attention. But even as they were repairing one family crisis, Catherine knew their public challenges were just beginning. The Prime Minister's visit that afternoon confirmed her worst fears about the political implications of the royal transition. Prime Minister Sarah Jenkins arrived at Buckingham Palace with a small entourage and a serious expression. Catherine had worked with her before on various charitable initiatives, but this was their first meeting where Catherine was effectively representing the crown. "Your Royal Highness," the PM began formally, then caught herself. The protocols around addressing someone who was acting as Queen Consort but technically still Princess of Wales were confusing even for seasoned politicians. "Catherine is fine," Catherine said with a smile, trying to ease the awkwardness. "We're all figuring out the new normal together." The political briefing that followed was sobering. Public opinion polls showed declining support for the monarchy, particularly among younger demographics. The Harry interview had amplified existing questions about the relevance and cost of the royal family. Most concerning, there were growing calls for a referendum on the monarchy's future. "The truth is," PM Jenkins explained, "we need you to be more visible, more accessible than previous generations of royals. The public wants to see that you understand their daily struggles, especially during the current economic challenges. Catherine nodded, making mental notes. This was familiar territory from her years as a working royal, but the scale was different now. Every appearance, every speech, every photograph would be analyzed for signs of whether the monarchy deserved to survive this transition. The PM continued, "We're also recommending some changes to royal protocols. Less formality, more direct engagement with the public." The Japanese state visit was well received because people saw genuine warmth and competence, not just ceremony. After the political meetings, Catherine found herself alone in the palace for the first time since the crisis began. She walked through the staterooms, past portraits of queens who had faced their own challenges. Queen Victoria, who had navigated the Industrial Revolution and imperial expansion. Queen Elizabeth II, who had modernized the monarchy and guided it through decades of social change. Each of these women had been thrust into roles they hadn't expected at ages when they felt unprepared. But they had adapted, evolved, and ultimately strengthened the institution they served. Catherine drew comfort from this historical perspective, even as she acknowledged that her challenges were unique to the modern era. The next few days brought a whirlwind of public engagements designed to reassure the nation about the stability of the monarchy. Catherine visited a food bank in East London, spent time with patients at a children's hospital, and toured a renewable energy facility in Scotland. Each engagement was carefully planned to demonstrate both royal continuity and modern relevance. But what surprised everyone, including Catherine herself, was how naturally she connected with people during these visits. At the children's hospital, she sat on the floor to color with young patients, her formal dress be damned. When a teenager asked her directly whether she was scared about becoming queen, Catherine answered honestly, "Every day." But being scared doesn't mean you stop trying to help people. The moment was captured by photographers and became the defining image of Catherine's early reign, not a formal portrait or ceremonial photograph, but a candid shot of someone being genuinely human while carrying the weight of royal responsibility. The Scottish renewable energy visit provided another breakthrough moment. Catherine had always been interested in environmental issues, but her new platform allowed her to engage with the subject at a policy level. She asked detailed technical questions, discussed government targets with facility managers, and spoke knowledgeably about the intersection of environmental protection and economic development. The facility's director later told reporters she wasn't just going through the motions. "This is someone who has done her homework and understands the complexities of the issues we're facing." These successful public engagements helped stabilize public opinion, but Catherine knew the real test would come with their first major crisis as the effective ruling couple. That test arrived sooner than expected, in the form of a devastating flood that struck Yorkshire just as autumn was turning to winter. The floods displaced thousands of families, destroyed historic market towns, and caused millions of pounds in damage. The government's response was swift but insufficient, and public anger was growing about inadequate flood defenses and slow emergency response. Catherine and William made the decision to visit the affected areas immediately, despite security concerns and logistical challenges. They wanted to show that the royal family understood the urgency of the situation and cared about the people affected. The helicopter flight to Yorkshire gave Catherine her first aerial view of the devastation. Entire villages were underwater, roads had become rivers, and rescue boats moved between houses like water taxis. The scale of the disaster was overwhelming, but what struck Catherine most was the human element. The families standing on rooftops waiting for rescue, the emergency workers laboring around the clock, the volunteers organizing relief efforts. Their first stop was an evacuation center in a local school gymnasium, where families were sleeping on cots and sharing whatever possessions they had managed to save. Catherine had visited disaster zones before, but never as someone with the power to influence the national response. She moved through the evacuation center methodically, spending time with each family, listening to their stories, taking notes about their specific needs. When an elderly man complained about the lack of prescription medication for displaced residents, Catherine immediately called her private secretary to ensure the issue reached the relevant government minister. A mother with 3 young children broke down while describing how they had lost everything when their house flooded. Catherine sat with her, holding her hands, letting her cry, without rushing to offer empty consolations. Sometimes she was learning, The most important thing royalty could do was simply witness people's pain. William was equally engaged, working with local emergency services to understand the coordination challenges and identify where royal influence might help cut through bureaucratic delays. His military background served him well in these crisis situations, allowing him to speak the language of emergency response professionals. But it was Catherine who made the emotional connection that became the defining moment of the visit. A teenage girl named Emma approached her shyly, explaining that she was supposed to start university the next week, but all her belongings, including her acceptance letters and student loan documents, had been destroyed in the flood. Catherine spent 20 minutes with Emma, getting all the details of her situation and making specific commitments about how the royal household would help her navigate the bureaucracy of replacing essential documents. More importantly, she gave Emma her personal contact information and promised to follow up personally. "University was my chance to make something of myself," Emma told Catherine. "I don't want to be another casualty of this disaster." Catherine's response became one of the most quoted statements of her early reign. "You're not a casualty, Emma. You're a survivor, and survivors don't give up on their dreams." The media coverage of the Yorkshire visit was overwhelmingly positive, but more importantly, it established a new model for royal crisis response. Instead of ceremonial visits that maintained distance from real problems, Catherine and William had demonstrated hands-on engagement with immediate practical results. The follow-up was just as important as the initial visit. Catherine personally ensured that Emma received help with her university documentation and even arranged for a scholarship from one of her patronage organizations to help with expenses. She also worked with government ministers to address systemic issues in flood response, using her influence to push for better coordination between agencies. 6 months later, Emma would start university as planned, but she never forgot the royal who had listened to her story and taken action. Her thank you letter to Catherine would become one of the personal treasures that reminded the future queen why the work was worth the sacrifice. The Yorkshire floods marked a turning point in public perception of the new royal leadership. Opinion polls showed significant improvement in support for the monarchy, with particular praise for Catherine's authentic engagement with people facing real problems. But success brought its own challenges. The increased public approval meant higher expectations for every subsequent engagement. Catherine found herself under constant scrutiny, with every outfit choice, every facial expression, every public statement analyzed for deeper meaning. The pressure was particularly intense because she was still technically the Princess of Wales, not the Queen. Constitutional experts debated the precedent being set by someone who wasn't the official Queen consort, taking on such a prominent role in national leadership. Catherine navigated these constitutional complexities with characteristic grace, always deferring to proper protocols, while quietly building the relationships and skills she would need as the eventual queen. She worked closely with the Queen's former private secretaries, learning from their decades of experience in managing the delicate balance between royal tradition and modern relevance. The most challenging aspect of this transition period was the constant uncertainty about King Charles's health. While he remained stable, his doctors were clear that any return to full royal duties was impossible. This left William in the difficult position of being Prince Regent with full royal powers, but no clear timeline for when he might actually become king. For Catherine, this uncertainty was both a blessing and a burden. It gave her time to grow into the role gradually, but it also meant living in a constant state of preparation for responsibilities that might be thrust upon her at any moment. The winter months brought additional challenges as the economic pressures facing the country intensified. Rising inflation, energy costs, and housing prices were creating genuine hardship for millions of families. The royal family faced increasing pressure to demonstrate that they understood and cared about these struggles. Catherine's response was to intensify her focus on issues that directly affected working families. She launched a major initiative on early childhood development, working with researchers and policymakers to address the root causes of educational inequality. She also expanded her patronage work to include organizations supporting families facing financial hardship. These initiatives required Catherine to master complex policy areas and work directly with government ministers and civil servants. It was a far cry from the ceremonial role that royal consorts had traditionally played, but it was exactly what the country needed during this difficult period. The learning curve was steep, but Catherine approached it with the same methodical preparation that had served her well throughout her royal career. She read briefing papers late into the night, consulted with experts in various fields, and gradually built a network of advisors who helped her understand the intricacies of policy development. By the time spring arrived, Catherine had established herself as a credible voice on domestic policy issues. Her speeches were quoted by policymakers, her initiatives received serious media coverage, and her visits to programs and facilities generated meaningful discussions about solutions to social problems. But perhaps most importantly, she had proven to herself that she could handle the weight of royal responsibility during a national crisis. The woman who had once worried about making small talk at dinner parties was now confidently discussing complex social issues with cabinet ministers and academic researchers. The transformation wasn't complete. Catherine knew she still had much to learn and many more tests to face. But she was no longer the uncertain figure who had watched palace staff prepare for the Japanese state visit with a mixture of awe and terror. She had become someone who understood that being royal wasn't about being perfect or always having the right answers. It was about showing up consistently, listening carefully, and using whatever influence you had to make a positive difference in people's lives. As she looked ahead to the challenges that undoubtedly lay ahead, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced since that first phone call from the palace. Confidence. Not the confidence of someone who had all the answers, but the confidence of someone who had learned she could find the answers when they mattered most. The secure phone in Catherine's private study rang at 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March. After months of royal crises, she had learned to recognize the difference between urgent calls and emergency calls by the tone of the ring itself. This was definitely an emergency. Sir Clive's voice was strained when she answered. "Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid I have very serious news. There's been an incident involving Prince George." Catherine's blood turned to ice. George had been on a school skiing trip in Switzerland, something that had required extensive security planning but had been approved because they wanted their children to have as normal experiences as possible. The carefully balanced life they had constructed between royal duties and family protection had just shattered. What kind of incident? Catherine's voice was remarkably steady, though her hands were shaking. There was an attempted kidnapping, ma'am. The Swiss authorities intervened successfully, and His Royal Highness is safe, but the security implications are extremely serious. We need to bring him home immediately. The next few hours passed in a blur of emergency protocols, secure communications with Swiss law enforcement, and frantic coordination between multiple intelligence agencies. Catherine found herself in the palace's crisis management center, surrounded by screens showing satellite feeds, communication transcripts, and real-time updates from Switzerland. William arrived from a military exercise in Scotland, his helicopter landing in the palace gardens just as dawn was breaking over London. The reunion was brief and professional. They would process the emotional trauma later when their son was safely home. The attempted kidnapping had been sophisticated and well-planned, involving multiple individuals with apparent connections to international criminal organizations. Swiss authorities had intercepted communications suggesting the goal was not just ransom, but using George as leverage against the British monarchy during its vulnerable transition period. "This changes everything," the head of Royal Protection explained during the briefing. "The threat level has escalated beyond anything we've previously managed. We need to completely reassess the security arrangements for all 3 children." Catherine listened to the security briefings with growing horror as the implications became clear. George's freedom of movement would be severely restricted. Charlotte and Louis would face new limitations. Their family life, already constrained by royal duties, would become even more regimented and protected. But the personal implications were only part of the crisis. The attempted kidnapping raised serious questions about the monarchy's vulnerability during the Regency period. If criminals were targeting the future king's children, what did that say about the stability of the institution itself? The Prime Minister arrived at the palace for an emergency briefing, accompanied by the Home Secretary and the head of MI5. The political ramifications were complex and potentially devastating. Public confidence in the monarchy's ability to protect itself, and by extension, to serve as a stable foundation for British society, was at stake. "We have 2 options," the PM explained grimly. "We can make this public immediately and control the narrative, or we can keep it classified and hope the story doesn't leak. Either choice carries significant risks." Catherine found herself in the surreal position of making decisions that could affect not just her family's safety, but the future of the British monarchy itself. The woman who had once worried about choosing the right outfit for a garden party was now weighing options that could determine whether her son would grow up to inherit a throne that still existed. The decision to make the incident public came after extensive consultation with intelligence agencies, political advisors, and constitutional experts. The risk of leaks was too high, and the story was too important to be told by anyone other than the royal family themselves. Catherine's statement to the nation was broadcast from Windsor Castle, where the family had relocated for enhanced security. She spoke directly to the camera, without notes, addressing the British people as both a mother and their future queen. Yesterday, our son George faced a threat that no child should ever have to experience. She began, her voice clear and controlled despite the emotional weight of the words. The swift action of Swiss law enforcement and our security services ensured his safety, and for that we are profoundly grateful. She paused, looking directly into the camera with the composure that had become her trademark during crisis situations. But I want to speak to you not just as George's mother, but as someone who understands that this incident represents a broader challenge to the values we hold dear as a society. The speech that followed was perhaps the most important of Catherine's royal career to that point. She spoke about the balance between openness and security, about refusing to let threats change the fundamental character of the monarchy, and about the responsibility of the royal family to demonstrate resilience in the face of danger. "We will not allow fear to dictate how we serve you," she concluded. "Our children will continue to be raised as future servants of this nation, prepared to lead with courage and compassion. That is our promise to you, and it is a promise we intend to keep." The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from across the Commonwealth and around the world. But more importantly, the British public rallied around their royal family with a unity that hadn't been seen since the early days of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. However, the real test of Catherine's leadership came in the weeks that followed, as the family had to navigate the practical implications of living under heightened security while maintaining their public duties. The attempted kidnapping had created a new reality where every public appearance carried additional risk. Catherine's approach to this challenge would define her legacy as a royal leader. Rather than retreating from public engagement, she made the decision to increase her visibility while adapting to new security requirements. If criminals thought they could intimidate the monarchy into withdrawal, she would prove them wrong. The first public engagement after the incident was deliberately chosen for maximum symbolic impact. Catherine visited a youth center in East London, an area where gang violence and criminal activity were ongoing concerns. The message was clear. The royal family would not be driven away from the communities that needed them most. The security arrangements for the visit were unprecedented, with multiple layers of protection and extensive background checks on everyone who would be present. But Catherine insisted on maintaining the personal interaction style that had become her signature, sitting with young people, listening to their stories, and engaging with their concerns about safety and opportunity. During the visit, a teenager named Marcus asked her directly about the kidnapping attempt. "Aren't you scared to be here?" he asked. "I mean, if someone tried to grab your kid, wouldn't you just stay home where it's safe?" Catherine's response became one of the defining quotes of her early reign. "Marcus, I learned a long time ago that you can't build a safe world by hiding from an unsafe one. The only way to make things better is to show up and do the work, even when it's scary." The visit was a success, but it established a new template for royal engagements that required extensive resources and planning. Every public appearance now involved security assessments that rivaled those for heads of state visits. The cost of protecting the royal family was becoming a political issue in itself. Catherine addressed this concern head-on during a speech to Parliament, the first time a Princess of Wales had addressed both houses since Princess Diana's famous speeches. She spoke about the balance between security and service, acknowledging the increased costs while making the case for why continued public engagement was essential. "The criminals who threatened our son wanted to drive us away from you," she told the assembled MPs. "They wanted to break the connection between the crown and the people it serves. We refuse to give them that victory." The speech was a political and personal triumph, but it also marked a new phase in Catherine's development as a royal leader. She was no longer simply responding to events, she was actively shaping the monarchy's response to modern challenges. The spring months brought additional tests as the family adjusted to their new security reality. George returned to school under heavy protection. Charlotte began asking difficult questions about why their lives had suddenly become so restricted, and Louis struggled to understand why he couldn't play in public parks without extensive security sweeps. Catherine found herself having conversations with her children that she had never imagined necessary. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that people might want to hurt him because of who his parents are? How do you maintain a sense of normalcy when your family is under constant protection? The solutions she developed became a model for other royal families facing similar challenges. Catherine created structured opportunities for the children to interact with their peers in secure environments. She established private recreational activities that provided normal childhood experiences without compromising security. Most importantly, she maintained honest communication with all 3 children about their situation. "We have extra protection because we have extra responsibilities," she explained to George during one of their private conversations. "One day, you'll use your position to help a lot of people. Right now, our job is to make sure you grow up safe and ready for that responsibility." George's maturity in handling the situation impressed everyone who worked with the family. Rather than becoming fearful or withdrawn, he seemed to understand that the security measures were necessary but temporary adaptations. His resilience became a source of strength for his parents during this difficult period. The summer brought a new challenge when intelligence agencies reported credible threats against other members of the royal family. The security apparatus that had been expanded to protect William's immediate family now had to extend to a much broader network of relatives, creating logistical and financial pressures that strained government resources. Catherine found herself in the unique position of coordinating security arrangements for extended family members while maintaining her own growing schedule of public duties. The administrative and logistical challenges were enormous, requiring skills in crisis management, resource allocation, and strategic planning that went far beyond traditional royal preparation. The turning point came during a Trooping the Color ceremony that had been planned as a display of royal continuity and strength. The event required months of security planning and represented the largest public gathering of the royal family since the kidnapping attempt. Catherine's appearance on the palace balcony, surrounded by her children and extended family, sent a powerful message about the monarchy's refusal to be intimidated. But the real significance of the moment was personal rather than political. Standing there, waving to the crowds, Catherine realized she was no longer afraid. The woman who had once been paralyzed by anxiety about royal protocols was now confidently managing security crises, political challenges, and family trauma simultaneously. The transformation had been gradual and painful, but it was complete. The aftermath of Trooping the Color brought unexpected developments in the kidnapping investigation. Swiss and British authorities had traced the criminal network to a larger international organization with connections to several high-profile crimes against public figures worldwide. The investigation revealed that the threat to the royal family was part of a broader campaign against democratic institutions and symbols of stability. The criminals weren't just targeting the monarchy for ransom or political leverage. They were trying to destabilize the foundations of British society itself. This revelation changed the entire context of the security challenges facing the royal family. They weren't just protecting themselves, they were defending the institution of constitutional monarchy against organized criminal attacks. The stakes were higher than anyone had initially realized. Catherine's response to this expanded threat demonstrated the leadership qualities that had emerged during months of crisis management. She worked closely with intelligence agencies to understand the broader criminal network, coordinated with international law enforcement to share information and resources, and helped develop security protocols that could protect not just the British royal family, but other democratic institutions facing similar threats. The international dimension of the threat also provided opportunities for diplomatic engagement. Catherine found herself working with security officials and government representatives from multiple countries, building relationships that would serve British interests for years to come. Her meetings with foreign security officials and diplomatic personnel showcased skills that surprised even her closest advisors. Catherine demonstrated detailed knowledge of international criminal law, sophisticated understanding of intelligence operations, and natural diplomatic instincts that made her an effective representative of British interests. "She's not just representing the crown anymore," one senior diplomat observed privately. "She's becoming a significant diplomatic asset in her own right." The autumn brought news that the international criminal investigation had achieved major breakthroughs. Multiple arrests had been made across Europe, and the network responsible for the threat against George had been significantly disrupted. While security measures would remain heightened, the immediate crisis was showing signs of resolution. Catherine marked this development with a speech to the European Parliament, addressing the importance of international cooperation in combating threats to democratic institutions. It was a remarkable moment, the future Queen of England speaking to European leaders about shared security challenges just years after Brexit had strained relationships between Britain and continental Europe. "Criminals who threaten our children threaten all our children," she told the Assembly. "When we stand together against these threats, we protect not just our individual families, but the values that make our societies worth defending." The speech was well received and helped rebuild some of the diplomatic bridges that had been damaged during the Brexit process. Catherine's personal experience with international criminal threats had given her credibility on security issues that traditional royal diplomacy couldn't have achieved. As the year drew to a close, Catherine found herself reflecting on the incredible journey from that first emergency phone call to her current role as an internationally recognized leader on security and diplomatic issues. The attempted kidnapping had been traumatic for her family, but it had also accelerated her development as a royal leader in ways that years of conventional preparation couldn't have matched. The Christmas message she delivered that year was deeply personal, reflecting on the challenges her family had faced and the support they had received from the British people and international community. But it also looked forward to the future with confidence and determination. "This year taught us that we are stronger than the threats we face," she said. "Not because we are without fear, but because we choose courage over fear, service over safety, and hope over despair." The woman who had once doubted her readiness for royal responsibility had become someone who could face international criminal threats, manage complex security operations, and represent British interests on the world stage. The crown hadn't just been thrust upon her. She had grown into it through trials that would have broken a lesser person. But Catherine knew that this was still just the beginning. King Charles remained in poor health, and the day would come when William would need to take the throne permanently. When that happened, all the skills and experience she had gained during this crisis period would be put to their ultimate test. For now, though, she had proven to herself and to the world that she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The attempted kidnapping had been meant to weaken the monarchy, but instead it had forged a queen who was stronger, more capable, and more determined than anyone could have imagined. The call came on a foggy November morning, not with the urgent ring of crisis, but with the solemn finality of inevitability. King Charles had passed away peacefully in his sleep at Highgrove House, surrounded by Camilla and his closest staff. After 18 months of declining health, the transition everyone had been preparing for was finally upon them. Catherine stood in the nursery at Adelaide Cottage, watching Louis play with his toy trains while she processed the magnitude of what had just changed. In the space of a single phone call, her husband had become King William V, and she had become Catherine, Queen of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms. The woman who had once been called Weighty Katie was now one of the most powerful figures in British society. The immediate aftermath was a carefully choreographed dance of constitutional protocol and personal grief. William had to return to London immediately for the Accession Council, where he would be formally proclaimed king. Catherine would follow with the children, all of them moving into Buckingham Palace for the transition period that would culminate in the coronation. But first, there were private moments that mattered more than any state ceremony. William knelt down to tell George, Charlotte, and Louis that their grandfather had died, and that Daddy was now the king. The conversation was heartbreaking and historic in equal measure, as three children tried to understand how their lives had just changed forever. "Does that mean I have to be king now too?" George asked, his 9-year-old mind struggling with concepts that constitutional scholars debated. "Not for a very long time," William assured him. "Right now, your job is just to be 9 years old. Mummy and I will take care of everything else." Charlotte, always the most emotionally intuitive of the three, asked the question that cut to the heart of their new reality. "Are we going to have to move away from our house?" Catherine sat beside her daughter on the nursery floor, surrounded by toys that suddenly seemed like relics of a simpler time. "We'll have new houses where we need to do our work," she explained carefully. "But we'll always be a family, no matter where we live." The drive to Buckingham Palace was Catherine's first journey as queen, though the titles still felt foreign and overwhelming. The children sat quietly in the back of the car, looking out at familiar London streets that now belonged to their father, in a way they never had before. The palace staff greeted them with the perfect balance of respect and warmth that Catherine had come to expect from the royal household. But there was something different in their manner now, a recognition that she was no longer the Princess of Wales learning to be queen consort, but the actual queen, with immediate responsibilities and ultimate authority. The first few days were a blur of meetings, briefings, and ceremonial obligations that had to be balanced with genuine mourning for Charles and concern for the children's adjustment. Catherine found herself managing state business while helping Louis understand why he couldn't go to his regular playgroup, and explaining to Charlotte why photographers were suddenly following them everywhere. The most challenging aspect of the immediate transition was the constitutional complexity of William's accession. Unlike previous successions, this one came after an extended regency period where William had already been exercising royal prerogatives. The legal and ceremonial aspects of the transition were unprecedented in modern British history. Catherine attended her first Privy Council meeting as Queen. Sitting beside William as constitutional lawyers explained the various proclamations and orders that needed to be signed. The business was technical and procedural, but she was struck by the reality that these documents would affect millions of people across the Commonwealth. "Your Majesty," the Lord President of the Council addressed her directly, "will need your signature on several orders relating to the Commonwealth realms, recognition of the succession." The phrase, "Your Majesty," still made Catherine want to look over her shoulder to see who was being addressed, but she signed the documents with steady hands, knowing that each signature was an acceptance of responsibilities she was finally ready to shoulder. The planning for King Charles's funeral consumed the next week, with Catherine playing a central role in balancing state protocol with family wishes. Charles had left detailed instructions for a ceremony that would be dignified but not overly elaborate, reflecting his lifelong commitment to environmental and social causes. Catherine's input on the funeral arrangements revealed the diplomatic skills she had developed during the Regency crisis. She worked with representatives from dozens of countries, managed complex logistics involving multiple royal families, and ensured that the ceremony honored Charles's memory while establishing the tone for the new reign. The night before the funeral, Catherine sat in her new private apartments at Buckingham Palace, reviewing her speech for the following day. As Queen, she would be expected to speak at the service, marking her debut in one of the monarchy's most solemn responsibilities. The speech she had written was deeply personal, reflecting on Charles's dedication to service and his love for his family. But it also looked forward, acknowledging the challenges facing the country and the monarchy's commitment to meeting them. It was Catherine's first major statement as Queen, and she knew it would set expectations for everything that followed. The funeral of King Charles III drew representatives from every Commonwealth realm and dozens of foreign nations. Westminster Abbey was filled with heads of state, religious leaders, and representatives of the charitable organizations Charles had supported throughout his life. Catherine's eulogy was delivered with the poise and emotion that had become her hallmarks during crisis situations. She spoke about Charles as a father-in-law who had welcomed her into the royal family with kindness, as a king who had served with dedication during challenging times, and as a man who had taught them all that service was not a burden but a privilege. Charles showed us that being royal is not about the titles we hold or the ceremonies we attend, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ancient abbey. It is about the difference we make in the lives of the people we serve. The international reaction to Catherine's funeral address was overwhelmingly positive. Foreign leaders praised her composure and eloquence, while British commentators noted the seamless transition from princess to queen that her performance represented. But for Catherine, the most meaningful moment of the funeral came when she saw George, Charlotte, and Louis walking behind their grandfather's coffin with remarkable dignity. Despite their young ages, all three children understood the solemnity of the occasion and conducted themselves with the bearing of future royals. The period between Charles's funeral and William's coronation was designed to allow for appropriate mourning while preparing the nation for a new reign. Catherine used this time to establish her own approach to queenly duties, building on the experience she had gained during the Regency but adapting to her new constitutional role. Her first major initiative as Queen was the launch of a comprehensive review of royal patronages and charitable affiliations. Catherine wanted to ensure that the monarchy's charitable work reflected the current needs of British society, while maintaining connections to organizations that had been supported for generations. The patronage review process gave Catherine the opportunity to visit dozens of organizations across the UK, seeing firsthand the challenges facing communities from Scotland to Cornwall. These visits were working engagements rather than ceremonial occasions, allowing her to develop detailed understanding of issues from mental health to climate change to economic inequality. During a visit to a homeless shelter in Birmingham, Catherine spent several hours talking with residents about their experiences and the support services available to them. The conversations were frank and sometimes difficult, but they gave her insights that no briefing paper could provide. "Your Majesty," one of the residents said to her directly, "most people in your position don't actually want to hear about what it's like to sleep rough. They want to feel good about helping without understanding the real problems." Catherine's response demonstrated the authenticity that had become her signature. "If I'm going to be any use to you, I need to understand what you're actually going through." Pretty speeches don't solve real problems. The conversation that followed was captured by photographers and became emblematic of Catherine's approach to royal service. Rather than maintaining formal distance, she engaged with difficult realities in ways that were both dignified and genuinely helpful. The spring months leading up to the coronation were filled with intensive preparation that went far beyond ceremonial planning. Catherine worked with constitutional experts to understand the full scope of her new role, with diplomatic officials to prepare for the international guests who would attend the coronation, and with security services to manage the massive logistical challenges of the event. But she also focused on preparing her children for the dramatic changes in their lives that the coronation would represent. George, as the heir apparent, would have specific ceremonial roles and would need to understand the significance of the occasion. Charlotte and Louis would also be prominent participants in a ceremony that would be watched by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. The family spent weekends at Windsor Castle, where Catherine and William could work on coronation preparations while the children enjoyed the relative privacy of the estate. These weekends became precious family time that balanced the increasing demands of their public roles. Catherine's approach to coronation planning reflected her years of experience in managing royal events, but scaled up to unprecedented proportions. She worked closely with the Archbishop of Canterbury on the religious aspects of the ceremony, with government officials on the political implications, and with international protocol experts on the diplomatic dimensions. The guest list for the coronation was itself a diplomatic challenge, requiring careful balance between traditional allies, Commonwealth partners, and emerging international relationships. Catherine's involvement in these discussions demonstrated the foreign policy expertise she had developed during the various crises of recent years. One of the most complex aspects of coronation planning was the integration of environmental considerations that reflected both Charles's legacy and William and Catherine's own commitments. The ceremony would need to be magnificent and traditional, while also demonstrating the monarchy's dedication to sustainability and environmental responsibility. Catherine worked with event planners to minimize the environmental impact of the coronation celebrations, from transportation arrangements for international guests to the sourcing of materials for decorations. These efforts received international attention and helped establish the new reign's commitment to environmental leadership. The weeks immediately before the coronation brought an intensity of preparation that tested every skill Catherine had developed during her years as a working royal. Media interviews, final fittings for ceremonial robes, rehearsals at Westminster Abbey, and briefings on the constitutional significance of each element of the ceremony filled her days from early morning until late at night. But Catherine also made time for the personal preparations that mattered most to her. She wrote letters to each of her children that they would receive on Coronation Day, explaining what the ceremony meant and how proud she was of them. She also wrote to her parents, thanking them for the support and love that had prepared her for this moment. The night before the coronation, Catherine stood in the same mirror where this story began, but everything had changed. The woman looking back at her was no longer uncertain or afraid. She was ready to be queen, not because she felt perfectly prepared, but because she had learned that being royal meant growing into responsibilities rather than waiting until you felt ready for them. William joined her at the mirror, both of them wearing the ceremonial robes they would wear the next day. "Any second thoughts?" he asked quietly. Catherine considered the question seriously before answering. "About being queen? No. About whether we can do this well. Every day. But I think that's probably how it should be." The coronation morning dawned clear and bright, with crowds already gathering along the processional route hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Catherine woke early, spending quiet time with her thoughts before the day's events began in earnest. The final preparations were handled with the precision that had become characteristic of royal events during Catherine's tenure as Princess of Wales. But there was an additional layer of significance to every detail, from the positioning of the crown to the timing of the processions, because this ceremony would establish the tone for decades of royal service to come. Catherine's transformation from princess to queen was complete, but the coronation would mark the beginning of a new chapter rather than the end of a journey. The woman who had once worried about making small talk at royal events was about to be crowned queen of one of the world's oldest continuous monarchies. As she prepared to leave Buckingham Palace for Westminster Abbey, Catherine took a moment to look back at the path that had brought her to this extraordinary moment. From that first phone call about Charles's heart attack to this coronation morning, she had grown into a role that she now understood was less about titles and ceremonies than about service and sacrifice. The journey to Westminster Abbey would take her through streets lined with hundreds of thousands of people who were there to witness history. But more importantly, it would take her to a ceremony where she would make promises about service and dedication that would define the rest of her life. Catherine, Queen of the United Kingdom, was ready to begin the reign that would determine whether the 1,000-year-old institution of the British monarchy would survive and thrive in the modern world. The woman who had once asked if anyone was ready had become someone who was prepared to find out. The moment Catherine's head touched the St. Edward's crown in Westminster Abbey, she felt the full weight of 1,000 years of British history settle upon her shoulders. The Archbishop of Canterbury's voice echoed through the ancient stone walls as he pronounced the words that formally made her queen, but Catherine was thinking about something far more personal. She was remembering the conversation she'd had with George that morning. "Mummy," her 10-year-old son had asked as she was getting dressed, "when you become queen today, will you still be my mummy?" It was such a simple question, but it captured everything Catherine cared most about. She had spent years learning to balance royal duty with personal relationships, and now she was taking on the ultimate royal role while trying to remain the mother, wife, and person she had always been. The coronation ceremony was flawless, a testament to months of meticulous planning and centuries of tradition. But what made it memorable was not the pageantry or the presence of world leaders, but the moments of genuine humanity that Catherine brought to every aspect of the ancient ritual. When young Prince Louis fidgeted during the long ceremony and started to whisper loudly about being bored, Catherine simply reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently while maintaining her composure, during one of the most solemn moments in British constitutional history. The image of the newly crowned queen comforting her 6-year-old son became one of the defining photographs of the day. The coronation banquet that evening was Catherine's first major social event as queen, attended by heads of state from around the world. But instead of the stiff formality that had characterized royal entertaining in previous generations, Catherine infused the evening with warmth and genuine conversation that put even the most nervous diplomatic guests at ease. During dinner, she sat between the President of France and the Prime Minister of Canada, managing to discuss everything from climate change policy to childhood education, while ensuring both felt genuinely heard and valued. Her ability to make state occasions feel personal had become her signature, and it was exactly what the monarchy needed in an increasingly informal world. The international guests left London with stories about a queen who remembered personal details from previous conversations, who asked thoughtful questions about their country's challenges, and who made them feel like valued partners rather than obligatory diplomatic contacts. These relationships would prove invaluable in the months and years ahead. The period immediately following the coronation was when Catherine truly began to establish her unique approach to being queen. Unlike previous monarchs who had inherited the throne at advanced ages with decades of preparation, Catherine was young, energetic, and determined to use her position to address contemporary challenges in ways that were both traditional and revolutionary. Her first major initiative as queen was the establishment of the Royal Commission on Social Mobility, a comprehensive review of barriers preventing people from disadvantaged backgrounds from accessing opportunities in education, employment, and civic participation. The commission was staffed with leading researchers, policy experts, and people with lived experience of social disadvantage. Catherine's personal involvement in the commission's work went far beyond ceremonial endorsement. She attended working sessions with researchers, visited communities affected by limited social mobility, and engaged directly with young people who were struggling to access opportunities despite their talents and determination. During one commission visit to a comprehensive school in Manchester, Catherine sat in on a careers guidance session where students were discussing their aspirations and the obstacles they faced. When a 16-year-old named Aisha explained that she wanted to study medicine but felt that universities weren't for people like her, Catherine spent 20 minutes discussing the various pathways to medical school and the support available for students from non-traditional backgrounds. "I want you to know," Catherine told Aisha, "that this country needs doctors who understand what it's like to face real challenges. Your background isn't a barrier to studying medicine. It's an asset that will make you a better doctor." The conversation was captured by school cameras and later shared with Catherine's permission. Aisha would later receive a scholarship to study medicine at Edinburgh University, but more importantly, her story inspired thousands of other young people to pursue ambitious goals they had thought were beyond their reach. Catherine's approach to royal visits had evolved significantly from the ceremonial occasions that had characterized the monarchy for generations. Instead of brief, highly managed encounters, she spent substantial time in communities, returning multiple times to follow up on initiatives and maintain relationships with people she had met. This sustained engagement approach was exemplified in her work with a housing estate in South London that had been struggling with poverty, crime, and limited opportunities for young people. Catherine's first visit was part of a broader initiative on social mobility, but she was struck by the resilience and potential she found in the community. Rather than making a single ceremonial visit and moving on, Catherine established an ongoing partnership between the royal household and community organizations on the estate. She returned every few months, always unannounced to the media, to check on progress and identify additional ways the monarchy could provide support. The sustained engagement bore fruit in ways that traditional royal patronage never could. Crime rates on the estate decreased significantly as young people gained access to better educational and employment opportunities. Community cohesion improved as residents felt genuinely supported by institutions that had previously seemed distant and irrelevant. Most importantly, from Catherine's perspective, she developed real relationships with estate residents who taught her things about British society that no briefing paper could convey. These relationships informed her policy positions, her charitable work, and her understanding of how the monarchy could remain relevant in communities that had historically felt excluded from national institutions. Catherine's queenship was also distinguished by her approach to international relations, which built on the diplomatic skills she had developed during various crises, but expanded them to address global challenges. Her first major international initiative was a Commonwealth-wide program addressing climate change impacts on vulnerable communities. Working with governments, NGOs, and research institutions across the Commonwealth, Catherine helped coordinate responses to climate-related disasters while supporting long-term adaptation strategies. Her personal involvement included visits to flood-affected areas in Pakistan, drought-stricken regions in Australia, and islands in the Caribbean threatened by sea level rise. The climate work showcased Catherine's ability to use royal influence for practical problem-solving, rather than just symbolic gestures. She leveraged her position to bring together resources, expertise, and political will in ways that individual governments or organizations couldn't achieve alone. During a visit to Bangladesh to see flood management projects, Catherine spent 3 days working alongside local officials and international aid workers to understand both the technical and human dimensions of climate adaptation. She waded through flooded villages, visited emergency shelters, and participated in planning meetings about long-term infrastructure improvements. "Your Majesty," the Bangladeshi Prime Minister told her during a formal dinner, "you are the first head of state to visit our flood zones during the rainy season. Most prefer to come when everything is dry and pretty." Catherine's response encapsulated her approach to royal service. "I can't help with problems I don't understand. If I'm going to be useful, I need to see what you're actually dealing with." The climate change work elevated Catherine's international profile and established her as a credible voice on global issues, but it also demonstrated to the British public that their queen was using her position to address challenges that affected everyone, not just traditional royal concerns. The domestic impact of Catherine's international work was significant. Young people in Britain saw their queen engaging seriously with the most important issues of their generation. while older citizens appreciated her commitment to Commonwealth relationships that connected Britain to its global partners. Catherine's approach to royal communications represented another major departure from traditional monarchy. Instead of relying primarily on formal statements and carefully controlled media appearances, she embraced direct communication through various platforms while maintaining appropriate dignity and discretion. Her annual Christmas message, delivered from Windsor Castle, became appointment television not just in Britain but throughout the Commonwealth. Unlike previous royal Christmas messages that focused on ceremonial reflections, Catherine's addresses tackled current challenges while offering genuine hope and practical encouragement. In her third Christmas message as Queen, Catherine spoke directly about the cost of living pressures facing many families. "I know that for many of you, this Christmas is more difficult than last year's," she said, looking directly into the camera with the sincerity that had become her hallmark. "When I visit food banks and family support centers, I see the impossible choices that good people are having to make between heating and eating, between rent and medicine." She continued, "But I also see the extraordinary generosity of communities coming together to support their neighbors. I see the volunteers who work extra shifts at food banks, the teachers who spend their own money on supplies for their students, and the neighbors who check on elderly residents during cold snaps." The message went on to announce specific royal initiatives to support struggling families, but it was Catherine's acknowledgement of real hardship that resonated most with viewers. This was a queen who understood what people were going through and was willing to use her platform to address uncomfortable realities. The personal cost of Catherine's approach to queenship was significant. The sustained engagement with communities, the international travel to challenging locations, and the emotional investment in difficult social problems took a toll that was rarely visible to the public. Catherine dealt with these pressures by maintaining strong family relationships and ensuring that her children remained her top priority despite the demands of royal duty. Family holidays were fiercely protected, even when international crises or domestic challenges required her attention. During a family skiing holiday in Switzerland, the same country where George had faced threats years earlier, Catherine enforced a strict rule that work calls were only allowed during designated hours. The rest of the time was devoted to helping Louis learn to ski, building snowmen with Charlotte, and teaching George about avalanche safety. "Mummy's job is important," she explained to Charlotte during one of their chairlift rides, "but being your mum is the most important thing I'll ever do. The queen part of me serves the country, but the mum part of me serves you, and that will never change." These family moments provided Catherine with the emotional grounding she needed to handle the pressures of royal responsibility. But they also served as examples to other working parents about the importance of maintaining family connections despite professional demands. Catherine's parenting approach as queen became a subject of international interest. She was raising 3 children who would grow up to serve the monarchy while trying to ensure they developed into well-rounded, empathetic adults who understood both their privileges and their responsibilities. George, as the future king, received additional preparation for his eventual role, but Catherine was careful to balance this with normal childhood experiences. He attended state occasions when appropriate, but was also encouraged to pursue interests in science and technology that had nothing to do with royal duties. Charlotte and Louis were raised with clear understanding of their roles as supporting members of the royal family, but Catherine emphasized that their primary obligation was to develop their own talents and interests. Both children showed academic promise and were encouraged to think about careers that would allow them to contribute to society in their own right. The approach to raising royal children that Catherine developed became a model for other royal families around the world. The balance between royal training and normal childhood development was complex, but Catherine's children showed remarkable poise and naturalness in public settings while maintaining obvious closeness to their parents. By her 5th year as queen, Catherine had transformed not just her own role but public expectations of what monarchy could accomplish in the modern world. Opinion polls showed consistently high approval ratings, but more importantly, there was evidence that the monarchy was genuinely making a difference in addressing social challenges. The Social Mobility Commission had led to significant policy changes in education and employment practices. The climate change initiatives had mobilized resources and attention that were helping vulnerable communities adapt to environmental challenges. The sustained community engagement had created new models for how institutions could maintain relevance in changing societies. Catherine's success as queen was measured not just in popularity or media coverage, but in practical outcomes that improved people's lives. She had proven that constitutional monarchy could be a force for positive change, rather than just a ceremonial relic. But perhaps most importantly, Catherine had shown that it was possible to be both effective queen and an authentic person. The woman who had once worried about being ready for royal responsibility had become someone who redefined what royal responsibility meant. On a quiet Sunday afternoon at Windsor Castle, Catherine sat in the same room where Queen Elizabeth II had recorded her Christmas messages for decades. She was reviewing briefing papers for the upcoming Commonwealth Summit, but her attention was drawn to voices from the garden where William was playing cricket with the children. Through the window, she could see George bowling to his father with the intense concentration he brought to everything, while Charlotte provided commentary that was making Louis giggle uncontrollably. It was a perfectly ordinary family scene that happened to involve the King of England and his children. Catherine smiled as she watched them, remembering that first phone call that had started their journey to the throne. They had asked if she was ready, and she had spent years learning that readiness wasn't about feeling prepared. It was about being willing to grow into responsibilities as they evolved. She had become the queen that England didn't know it needed. Someone who combined traditional dignity with modern empathy. Someone who understood that serving the crown meant serving the people, and someone who proved that the monarchy could adapt to contemporary challenges while maintaining its essential character. The afternoon sun streamed through the ancient windows of Windsor Castle as Catherine returned to her briefing papers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, and new ways to prove that the institution of monarchy could thrive in the 21st century. She had found her answer to that original question about readiness. None of them had been ready for what came next, but they had been willing to learn, to grow, and to serve. And in the end, that willingness had been enough to transform not just their lives, but the very nature of what it meant to be royal in the modern world. Catherine, Queen of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms, had become exactly the monarch her country needed, precisely because she had never stopped being the person she had always been. The crown had not changed her. She had changed what it meant to wear the crown.